Good morning. Welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress, and I'll be your host for the next hour. Reading a discussion of Chapter 57 in this book, a highly recommended book. And we're talking about 9/11. The title of the chapter is 9/11, A New Pearl Harbor, or The Road to Tyranny. Very appropriate title for this chapter, as we will soon discover. The author begins by asking, have you heard of PNAC, the Project for the New American Century? PNAC, a neoconservative Washington-based think tank, was created in 1997. In September 2000, PNAC released a report entitled Rebuilding America's Defenses, Strategies, Forces, and Resources for a New Century, which called for and predicted the following. Number 1, massive hikes in military spending. Number 2, the establishment of American military bases in Iraq and Saudi Arabia. Number 3, U.S. willingness to violate international treaties. Number 4, U.S. control of world's energy sources. Number 5, U.S. development of space-based weapons. Number 6, advanced forms of biological warfare that can target specific genotypes may transform biological warfare from the realm of terror to a politically useful tool. And number 7, United States willingness to use nuclear weapons to accomplish its goals. And number 8, possible conflict with China. Reader, that was in 2000, 1 year, just 1 year before 9/11. The proposal is available in its entirety on the Internet on the PNAC website. You can read it for yourself. Knowing full well that the decent American people would never support their outrageous goals unless they were thoroughly traumatized first, page 52 of the proposal, that is the PNAC proposal, states, quote, further, the process of transformation, even if it brings revolutionary change, is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor, unquote. That's verbatim. You can read it from yourself. Now, Michael Schwartz, professor of sociology at Stony Brook University, has confirmed in his book entitled War Without End that in 1998, the out-of-power Republican Party formed a policy advocacy group called the Project for a New American Century. Professor Schwartz reveals that the group's membership included Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz, and dozens of other key individuals, quote, who would later hold key positions in the administration of George W. Bush, unquote. Only a year before Bush Jr. was jobbed into office, this same group of neocons, led by Rumsfeld and Cheney, issued a policy document entitled Rebuilding America's Defenses, advocating what is now known as the Rumsfeldian Doctrine. The document stated that in order to justify another American military invasion of Iraq, they would need, quote, some catastrophic and catalyzing event, unquote. Notice the language, the same is used in PNAC, and according to the document, quote, public approval could not be obtained without a new Pearl Harbor, unquote. More PNAC language. Now, there are those who say that since the American government planned to stage fake terror attacks against its own people in 1962, what's to keep them from staging fake attacks nearly 40 years later when they have so much more technology with which to orchestrate the attacks and are so much more motivated to achieve their hidden agenda? Do these conspiracy theories have documented proof, irrefutable proof, that the United States government is capable of conspiring to plot the magnitude of evil of 9/11 against its own citizens? It would seem so. There is a document known as Operation Northwoods, which, although created long before 9/11, does show that the United States government indeed had a plan to kill its own citizens for a quote-unquote greater cause. This top-secret document was presented to President John F. Kennedy on March 13, 1962, and was only declassified in 1997. But it took 3 years before the Baltimore Sun and the ABC News ran the story on the document in 2001. The document is available from dozens of reputable online sources, such as the National Security Archive located at George Washington University, and is thoroughly analyzed by author James Bamford in his 2001 book entitled Body of Secrets. What are the contents of this document? The goal of Operation Northwoods was to get public support for an invasion of Cuba. The Joint Chiefs of Staff believed that America would only support a war against Cuba if it could be shown that Cuban terrorists had carried out a number of surprise attacks against the United States. The document suggests the United States government staged fake terror attacks against American citizens. The document explains, quote, such a plan would enable a logical buildup of incidents to be combined with other seemingly unrelated events to camouflage the ultimate objective and create the necessary impression of Cuban rashness and irresponsibility on a large scale, unquote. The specific recommendations made in the Northwoods document included, number one, staged mock attacks, sabotage, and riots, and blame it on Cuban forces. Number two, sink an American ship at the Guantanamo Bay American military base or destroy American aircraft and blame it on Cuban forces. Number three, harassment of civil air traffic, attacks on surface shipping, and destruction of U.S. military drone aircraft by MiG-type planes would be useful as complementary actions. Number four, destroy a fake commercial aircraft supposedly full of college students off on a holiday. And number five, stage a terror campaign including the real or simulated sinking of Cuban refugees. What do you think, reader? Does that not sound like the Joint Chiefs were plotting a conspiracy involving the hijacking of an aircraft? If in 1962 the higher-ups in the United States government were prepared to plan and stage fake terror attacks against its own citizens, what is to say they did not stage fake attacks, or rather real attacks, on 9/11? But I hear you say, quote, that was 40 years ago. You couldn't possibly be suggesting that this could happen today, or did happen on 9/11. Quote, unquote, my response to you is this: why not? Why not, reader? Answer that. In 2002, U.S. Today reported a bizarre coincidence that occurred on the very day of the 9/11 terror attacks, that a U.S. intelligence agency was set to run an exercise on September 11th at 9 a.m. in which a commercial aircraft would crash into one of its buildings near Washington, D.C. This was posted on USA Today on October 22nd, 2002, or August 22nd, 2002. It was just an incredible coincidence that this happened to involve an aircraft crashing into our facility, Agent Hubald said. Quote, as soon as the real-world events began, we canceled the exercise, unquote. Sure you did. The U.S. Today article quoted above was titled, Federal Agency Planned Plane Crashing into Buildings Drill Last September 11th. Now, that's a fact that is stranger than fiction, isn't it, reader? Let us now review what really happened on 9/11. Let us separate the real from the fiction, the cold, hard, unpalatable truth from the outrageous conspiracy theories. Now, chapter 58 of the book is entitled The Day the Towers Fell. What, when, why, and how. It begins with an anonymous quote. It says, it was one of those string of accidents, not unlike producing artificial earthquakes and tidal waves by tapping the heat at the Earth's center, unquote. Well, it continues, we're flying low, very, very low. Oh, my God, we're flying too low, unquote. The final and chilling words of terrified flight attendant Amy Sweeney telling airport ground controllers of her last images of the last moments of her last seconds just before the hijacked American Airlines Flight 767, designated Flight 11, strikes the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City on 9/11. The Twin Towers had come to occupy a unique and symbolic place in the culture of New York City and America. And so the terrorist attacks, the quote-unquote terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center towers and the Pentagon on September 11, 2001, brought shock and horror to the citizens of the United States of America and to the world. In the minds of most people, September 11, 2001 was a benchmark for human wickedness. The jury is still out on that as far as those who know otherwise are concerned, but be that as it may, what are the facts surrounding 9/11? Who brought down the towers? It would certainly appear that it was not the terrorists. Now, 9/11, the facts. September 11, 2001, the following events take place between 8:46 a.m. and 10:28 a.m., a time which for millions around the world is the most memorable and the most terrifying 102 minutes of their lives. At 8 hours, 46 minutes, 40 seconds, American Airlines Flight 11 crashes into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. When American Airlines Flight 11 crashes into the North Tower, allegedly by Mohammed Atta, an Arab Jordanian, it cuts through floors 93 to 99, instantly killing hundreds on impact. Hundreds more remain alive inside the tower, but trapped. 18 minutes later, at 9 hours, 3 minutes, 11 seconds, United Airlines Flight 175, a Boeing 767, headed from Boston to Los Angeles, torpedoes the South Tower of the World Trade Center. At 9 hours, 37 minutes, 46 seconds, American Airlines Flight 77, a Boeing 757 from Dulles International Airport, Washington, bound for Los Angeles, is allegedly crashed into the western wall of the U.S. Pentagon. I say allegedly because conspiracy theorists claim the Pentagon crash was suspicious because there was no publicly available closed-circuit television footage showing an aircraft hitting the building, and because the damage to the facade appears too small, not what one would expect, having been caused by a large commercial jetliner. The 9/11 report, page 314, states, quote, the Pentagon was hit by Flight 77. All 64 people aboard the airliner were killed, as were 125 people inside the Pentagon, of which 70 were civilians and 55 were military service members, unquote. At 9 hours, 58 minutes, 59 seconds, 56 minutes after the United Flight 175 crashes as seen in the earlier timeline into the Second World Trade Center, that is the South Tower, the tower collapses. This second tower collapsed in just 10 seconds, killing all civilians and emergency personnel inside, as well as a number of other individuals. The building collapsed into itself, causing a ferocious windstorm. Now, before I continue reading this timeline, I want to remind my listeners that those buildings were impacted at the higher elevations of the building. Now, I have to ask you a question. If they were impacted at such high altitudes in the buildings, the 90th floor or thereabouts, what about all the undamaged floors below the impact areas? Wouldn't they create some resistance to the fall of the building and eventually arrest the collapse of the buildings altogether? Why would the building fall from top to bottom on top of itself, not tipping over like a tree, but more than that, why would it collapse at free fall speed as though the remaining undamaged floors below the impact areas held virtually no restraint to the collapse? It would take roughly 10 seconds for a bowling ball to fall off the top floor of the buildings, and that's how fast the buildings fell. Free fall speed. It's physically impossible unless there were progressive detonations on the successive floors beneath the impact areas that rendered the seemingly undamaged floors completely unable to arrest or even to slow down the collapse. I'm talking about one of the most sophisticated building demolitions ever seen. Technology that is not demonstrated with such precision anywhere in the world. Now, the author continues, at 10 hours, 2 minutes, 23 seconds, United Airlines Flight 93, a Boeing 757 flying from Newark to San Francisco, allegedly crashes in an open field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Conspiracy theories are adamant that no plane ever crashed there because the footage shows no large pieces of visible wreckage one would expect at a plane crash site, and that there is a ridiculously small hole left for a large plane that would have been traveling near 580 miles an hour. They also allege that the plane was shot down and broke up in midair, spreading debris over a wide area. In fact, to be fair, the very first television network of reports said that Flight 93 had been shot down by a military jet. The printed press said, quote, local residents said that they had seen a second plane in the area, possibly an F-16 fighter, and burning debris falling from the sky. FBI agent Crowley said investigators had determined that 2 other planes were nearby, but didn't know if either was military, unquote. This is from the story entitled, Stories Swirl Around Pennsylvania Crash, Black Box Found, published in USA Today, September 14, 2001. And another quote, another press report, quote, pieces of the wreckage have been found as far away as New Baltimore, about 8 miles from the crash site. When the eastbound plane crashed, a 9-knot wind was blowing from the southeast. Federal Bureau of Investigation agent Crowley said, quote, or unquote. Now, this comes from an article entitled Bereaved May Visit Flight 93 Site, published in Pittsburgh Tribune Review, Friday, September 14, 2001. So the initial reports, as reported in the mainstream media, were that the airliner was shot down by a military aircraft. That was the initial report. The author continues now, he says, and the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, September 13, 2001, reported, quote, residents and workers at businesses outside Shanksville, Somerset County, reported discovering clothing, books, papers, and what appear to be human remains. Some residents said they collected bags full of items to be turned over to investigators. Others reported what appeared to be crash debris floating in Indian Lake, nearly 6 miles from the crash site, unquote. From the article entitled Investigators Locate Black Box from Flight 93, Widened Search Area in Somerset Crash, dated Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, September 13, 2001. We will look at some of the other eyewitness reports later. At 17 hours 20 minutes, World Trade Center Building 7, a steel frame, 47-story building close to the two main towers, collapses. And I'll add that it too fell at free fall speed, unhit by any airplanes. Only superficial damage to the facade of the building from falling debris from the twin towers. A few random fires on a couple floors in the building, but actually no discernible reason for that building to collapse at all, much less at free fall speed. It was not hit by any aircraft. 9/11 conspiracy theory suggests that it was destroyed deliberately because it held sensitive and compromising documents in the offices of the CIA, the Department of Defense, and Secret Service, which were all housed in the building. The North Tower collapses a half an hour after the first World Trade Center tower at 10 hours 28 minutes. Now, we're going to talk about George W. Bush, who I assert was part of this plot, this PNAC plot, this New World Order catalyzing event ordered by PNAC, the new Pearl Harbor. That's what 9/11 was. He's going to talk about outrageous conspiracy theories and malicious lies. Listen to what he says. Shortly after 9/11, President Bush advised people not to tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories about the attacks of September 11th. Quote, we must speak the truth about terror, said Bush. Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories concerning the attacks of 11 September. Malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves, away from the guilty, unquote. Bush added, and it says Philip Zelikow, who directed the work of the 9/11 Commission, likewise warned against such outrageous conspiracy theories. You know, the most outrageous conspiracy theory ever told about 9/11 was the official government story. That terrorists knocked down those buildings. Our own government knocked down those buildings. We're talking about what Bush said immediately after 9/11. Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories concerning the attacks of September 11th. Malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves, away from the guilty. Why did President Bush think it necessary to stand up before the world and defy people, to defy the government's official story? Because it was a bungled operation. There was too much in-your-face, plain evidence that it was not a terror attack, not an Arab terror attack. Oh, it was a terror attack, no doubt. but that our own government did it. And it was such a clumsy operation that it needed cover. And Bush, the most powerful man in the government, stood up and literally warned everybody not to look too closely at what happened. Because there's no other way to explain Building 7. There's no way to explain how 3 buildings in Manhattan, steel frame buildings, modern buildings, the Twin Towers were essentially designed to absorb several repeated impacts by high-performance, wide-body commercial jet airliners. How a 47-story steel frame building, literally, without being hit by an airplane, fell into its own footprint at free fall speed. How 2 110-story buildings collapsed in on themselves and falling at free fall speed nonetheless. The laws of common sense will not permit the American people to believe the official story. Those who believe the official story, I don't mean to belittle. I think it's just an attempt of self-preservation. I think they sincerely deny the so-called conspiracy theories just out of a means of self-preservation, to preserve their own psyches. No one wants to admit that our own government did 9/11. No one wants to admit that our own government waged war, terror, against the citizenry of this country, destroying American property. No one wants to admit that they cooked it all up ahead of time, calling it a new Pearl Harbor. A necessary event, a catalyzing event to move this nation to war, to help advance the cause of the New World Order. But that's precisely what happened. Yes, it was absolutely necessary for George W. Bush to stand up in front of the world and essentially threaten the world. Let us not tolerate any outrageous conspiracy theories concerning the attacks of 9/11 September, malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves and away from the guilty. No, let's not have anyone in this free society have the freedom of speech to use his own brain and to communicate the truth that it was George W. Bush, Donald Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, Condoleezza Rice, and the CIA director, George J. Tenet, and many other principal people in the highest echelons of our government that did 9/11 and covered it up. They got by killing John F. Kennedy, didn't they? They intimidated the world. They put in a commission to investigate, and they covered it up. They simply used that as a rehearsal for what they did on 9/11. The 9/11 Commission was a kangaroo court whose verdict was in hand before the investigation ever started. They were spoon-fed the information they got. We're going to talk about that as we continue our reading and discussion of this book. P.D. Stewart's telling the truth. 9/11 was an inside job, a false flag operation just like they planned to conduct against the American citizenry back in 1962 to justify a war against Cuba. And they used airplanes to do it. It's a hideous reality. But it's not one that Inquisition Update is going to hide from or be quiet about. The book continues in June 2005. Robert Gates, the former director of the Central Intelligence Agency and current Secretary of Defense, kept on that role by Barack Obama, again argued, quote, "The American people know what they saw with their own eyes on September 11, 2001, to suggest any kind of government conspiracy in the events of that day goes beyond the pale, unquote. Well, what about the U.S. government's plan to stage fake terror attacks against its own citizens in 1962? You recall the recommendations made in the United States government's Northwoods documents? Here they are again. Number 1, stage mock attacks, sabotages, and riots and blame it on Cuba. Number 2, sink an American ship at the Guantanamo Bay American military base or destroy American aircraft and blame it on Cuban forces. Number 3, harassment of civil air traffic, attacks on surface ships, and destruction of U.S. military drone aircraft by MiG-type planes. Number 4, destroy a fake commercial aircraft supposedly full of college students off on a holiday. Number 5, stage a terror campaign including the real or simulated sinking of Cuban refugees. What say Mr. Bush, Mr. Zelikow, and Mr. Gates to these quote-unquote outrageous government-orchestrated acts of real or simulated terror? Reader, this is why knowledge is power. When you have information about historic and other events, you can more easily refute the charge of outrageous conspiracies and confound the skeptics and the sycophants in government and officialdom. In any event, why should we accept the theory or the explanation from Mr. Bush, a man known to have very little scruples about lying to the American public? He deliberately lied about weapons of mass destruction. He intentionally lied about his membership of Skull and Bones. He lied about the continuing support he received from Skull and Bones. He lied about his religion, claiming to be Protestant, when in fact, according to his close associate, Paul Weyrich, Mr. Bush is a quote-unquote secret Catholic. Similarly, John DiIulio, Bush's first director of faith-based initiatives, called the former president a quote-unquote closet Catholic. And what distinguishes an outrageous theory from one that is not anyway? What other theory is there besides than that presented by the United States government? This is one of the central questions in the philosophy of science. When confronted by rival theories, let's say neo-Darwinian evolution and intelligent design, scientists and philosophers of science ask, which theory is better and why? The mark of a good theory is that it can explain in a coherent way all or at least most of the relevant facts and is not contradicted by any of them. A bad theory is one that is contradicted by some of the relevant facts. An outrageous theory would be one that is contradicted by virtually all of the relevant facts. Ladies and gentlemen, the official story of 9/11, that produced by our government, is an outrageous theory. With this definition in mind, let's look at a few of the facts alleged about the airplanes used, the identity of the hijackers, and their property, which they were supposed to have taken aboard or sent with their luggage on the doomed flights. The standard story, or theory, if you please, regarding 9/11 is that Osama bin Laden and his followers were angry at the United States because they had built bases located near Muslim holy sites in Saudi Arabia. Motivated by this anger, bin Laden and his agents supposedly attacked the United States. The variations to this story are as numerous as the number of hijackers themselves. Many people believe that elements of the government knew of the attacks beforehand and allowed them to happen. Or worse, an even more heinous proposition, that the elements of the U.S. government actually orchestrated the attacks so as to gain domestic support for 2 wars and to pass some of the most draconian, and I will say Dark Age papal laws ever enacted in a democratic country. And I'm officially stating for the record, I believe in the second thesis, that our own government did 9/11 for a purpose, to go on a holy Roman crusade against the heretic Muslims in the Middle East, to secure the Middle East for an eventual reign of the Pope from Jerusalem, and to reduce this Protestant nation to a subservient, obedient, compliant, totally brain-dead Catholic nation. Now, the author continues, he says, let's look closely at some alleged facts put forward. Take, for example, the passport of Atta, said to have been found near Ground Zero, recovered perfectly unscathed one day after 9/11. How did this item escape the towering inferno unblemished? What about the ID card of a Flight 77 passenger found perfectly intact at the site of the Pentagon meltdown? Then there is the visa of Ziad Jarrah on Flight 93. Although I admit it's not impossible, it does seem highly improbable that one would find a perfectly intact ID card or passport amidst all that devastation. On July 15, 2009, an Iranian passenger aircraft on its way to Armenia crashed in a farmer's field and exploded on impact, leaving a huge crater in the ground. Investigators on the ground found only disintegrated items such as passengers, personal belongings, including ID cards. No whole or intact IDs were found. Here are some other troubling facts. What are the odds that all the black box flight recorders were damaged beyond use? Also, why were the alleged hijackers' names not on the passenger lists? Why did Mohammed Atta, one of the alleged hijackers, take a curiously worded will and burial instructions in his suitcase on a suicidal flight? This Atta chap thought of everything, didn't he? Even the disposal of his possessions after his passing. Why would Atta take a full suitcase with him anyway when he knew he was going to die? And why did the seat numbers of the hijackers given in a cell phone call from flight attendant Madeline Amy Sweeney to Boston Air Traffic Control not match the seats occupied by the men the FBI claims were responsible? The suitcase of Atta is alleged to have contained a separate 5-page letter that instructed the hijackers how to prepare for their last days of life, including advice to bring along their wills. That letter was first reported in the Washington Post on September 28th. Now, what use would such wills have in a plane hijacking? None. So why instruct his assistants to bring their wills? Reader, might this be just an outrageous lie from the FBI? What do you think? Also in question, writes Greg Szymanski of Rents.com, quote, is the quick identity made of all the passengers on board, as the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology supposedly positively identified 176 of the 189 people killed at the Pentagon by November 16, 2001, a task several credible pathologists consider remarkable considering the extent of damage. It should be noted that specifics of the autopsy were never revealed, but conducted under cover at a military hospital in Dover, Delaware, unquote. Greg Szymanski also cites an article written by Dr. Thomas Olmsted, which article alleges that the government pathology report was highly inconsistent and filled with many discrepancies. Dr. Olmsted writes, quote, the AFIP, that is the pathology report, suggests these numbers: 189 killed, 125 worked at the Pentagon, and 64 were passengers on the plane. The American Airlines list only had 56, and the list just obtained has 58. They did not explain how they were able to tell victims' bodies from hijackers' bodies. In fact, from the beginning, no explanation has been given for the extra five suggested in news reports, except that the FBI showed the pictures to make up the differences, and that makes it so. So I figured that the government would want to quickly dispel any rumors. It seemed simple. Produce the names of all the bodies identified by the AFIP and compare it with the publicized list of passengers. So I sent a Freedom of Information Act request to the AFIP and asked for an expedited response, because we were getting ready to send our boys to war on the pretext that Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein had done the deed. 14 months later, a few U.S. soldiers dead, many Iraqi civilians pushing up daisies, and I finally get the list. Believe me that they weren't a bit happy to give it up, and I really have no idea why they chose now to release it. No Arabs wound up on the morgue slab. However, 3 additional people not listed by American Airlines sneaked in. I've seen no explanation of these extras. I did give American the opportunity to revise their original list, but they have not responded. The new names are Robert Ploger, Zandra Ploger, and Sandra Teague. The AFIP claims that the only passenger body that they were not able to identify is the toddler Dana Falkenberg, whose parents and young sister were on the list of those identified. The satanic masterminds behind this caper may be feeling pretty smug about the perfect crime, but they have left a raft of clues. And although Callie was listed as one of the people killed in the crash, and her paper ID was supposedly found in the rubble intact, consider the fact the FBI never provided DNA profiles of the hijackers to medical examiners for identification, because the official position was that, quote, there was a giant fireball on impact that not only destroyed the airplane, but actually vaporized the metal, unquote. Now, what about the anatomy of the Twin Towers? The World Trade Center complex was built for the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. Construction began in 1966, and tenants began to occupy its space in 1970. The World Trade Center actually consisted of 7 buildings, including 1 hotel spread across 16 acres of land. 1 World Trade Center, that is the North Tower, and 2 World Trade Center, the South Tower, were the signature structures containing 10.4 million square feet of office space. Each tower had 110 stories and about 1,350 feet in height. Each wall measured 208 feet in length. The buildings were connected by an underground mall called the Concourse. On any given workday, up to 50,000 office workers occupied the towers, and around 40,000 people passed through the complex. The Twin Towers contained 43,000 windows, 600,000 square feet of glass, 200,000 tons of structural steel, 5 million square feet of gypsum, 6 acres of marble, and 425 cubic yards of concrete. The internal core, or the support structure of the towers, consisted of steel columns which extended from the basements through the roofs. Each tower had 3 central stairwells which ran essentially from top to bottom, and 99 elevators. Generally, elevators originating in the lobby ran to sky lobbies on higher floors, where additional elevators carried passengers to the tops of the buildings. The World Trade Center had been the target of terrorist attacks before 9/11. At 12:18 p.m. on February 26, 1993, a 1,500-pound bomb stashed in a rental van was detonated on a parking garage ramp between the Twin Towers. The explosion killed 6 people, injured about 1,000 more, and exposed vulnerabilities in the World Trade Centers and the city's emergency preparedness. To address the problems encountered during the response to the 93 bombing, the Port Authority spent an initial $100 million to make physical, structural, and technological improvements to the World Trade Center, as well as to enhance its fire safety plan and reorganize and bolster its fire safety and security staffs. Yet, says David R. Griffin, skeptically, the crashing of a single airplane almost at the top of a 110-story building, reducing them to piles of rubble no more than three stories high, and most of the steel beams and columns came down in sections conveniently about 30 feet long, as if they were being readied to be loaded on trucks. According to Griffin, given the official explanation of the collapses known as the pancake theory, most of those massive steel structures should have been still standing. But, says Griffin, the 9/11 Commission report, quote, overcame this problem by declaring that the interior core of the buildings was a hollow steel shaft. And the American people bought it because they always expect the truth from their government. Again, 9/11 was an inside job. The evidence is overwhelming. No, the evidence is irrefutable. Our own government did 9/11. And that can only spell one thing for the American people: tyranny. A fascist police state is in the offing for the American people. And how better to prepare this once Protestant nation for a papal dictatorship, a new world order, that which is predicted in the Bible. Now, the book has several high-resolution drawings and diagrams and photographs of the buildings, detailed photographs of the so-called hijackers. The author continues, he says, according to the official 9/11 Commission report, quote, Atta had been selected by CAPPS in Portland, and 3 members of his hijacking team, Sagami, Wael al-Shari, and Walid al-Shari, were selected in Boston. Yet their selection affected only the handling of their checked bags, not their screening at the checkpoint. All 5 men cleared the checkpoint and made their way to the gate for American Flight 11. Atta, Omari, and Sagami took their seats in business class, seats 8D, 8G, and 10B, respectively. The Shari brothers had adjacent seats in row 2, Wael in 2A, and Walid in 2B in the first-class cabin. They boarded American 11 between 7:31 and 7:40 a.m., unquote. The Hazmi brothers were selected for extra scrutiny by the airline's customer service representative because, according to the 9/11 Commission report, quote, one of the brothers did not have photo identification, nor could he understand English, and because the agent found both the passengers to be suspicious. And yet, the only consequence to their selection was that their checked bags were held off the plane until it was confirmed that they had boarded the aircraft. I see we've run out of time.